Johnny Mac's got the NFL news and notes. Got a lot going on. Got football tonight. Dallas and Washington. Philly and Seattle Sunday night. And the Giants and the Raiders on Sunday. That takes care of the NFC East. Let's dive into the latest NFL news and notes with John McMullen now on the Sports Bash Live on 97.3 ESPN. John, welcome back, pal. How are you?
Doing well. How are you guys?
Do you get like a nice tingle up your spine entering to the Ric Flair ballad?
I do. I feel like giving you a woo, but I don't want to do it every day. I want to save it. Maybe tomorrow, if the Eagles clinch the NFC East, maybe we'll start it with a woo.
They have a chance to do it tonight, right? With a Cowboy win, a Cowboy loss or tie. The Eagles can still win the division if the Cowboys win and something else happens on Sunday. But a Cowboys loss tonight, and there'll be a little champagne popping all throughout the Delaware Valley.
Yeah, there will. I don't know, actually, how much champagne will be shopping. It's just one small step, and obviously the Eagles have greater goals. But if you go back to the preseason, if you go back to training camp, and to imagine you'd be here and winning the NFC East, it would have been a big deal. Now it doesn't seem like a big deal, but it's the first step to hopefully – from the Eagles standpoint, a couple of steps, and that's the number one seed and eventually the Super Bowl.
So, John, do you like that the Eagles can clinch this early? Do you think they like that they can clinch this early? Is this team convinced you that they can handle this?
Yeah, I mean, I think I talk about it all the time. We've mentioned the word trap game a lot this season. I think it started when they went out to Los Angeles the first time against the Chargers. And they've always been able to focus and handle it. I think last week was the latest example. And generally, when they play these teams that you're supposed to take for granted, they've really, really beaten them up. So I think that tells you they've been able to keep their focus. And I don't see that changing because of the landscape. And the Eagles aren't playing for the NFC East anymore. They're playing to get a first-round bye, to get the number one seed, and they realize there are teams right behind them. So if they do slip up, that could be gone very, very quickly.
But they're also in a situation now where they have this West Coast trip, and the comments that they made that they're fired up about it. We talked earlier today to Sal Powell, and he talked about how players are a product of routine. They like routines, and their routine is going to change on this trip.
Yeah, they are, and they are. There's arguments, and we talked to Pete Carroll earlier this week, and he doesn't do that. Nobody generally. From a consistent standpoint, the Seahawks, obviously, because of where they're located, they have some difficult issues every year as far as travel goes. And in the past, when they've had two consecutive games back east, they do not stay. They come back to Seattle and then travel again. So there's obviously a couple ways to handle it. Sal brings up a good point. People in the NFL generally are creatures of habit, and they like structure. So it is a bit of a roll of the dice to stay out on the West Coast and change all of that. And all we can do is see how it works out. And I think hindsight will be the ultimate judge for that. But I haven't seen, as I said, I haven't seen this team lose focus at all this season. I don't think they're going to lose focus. That's not to say they're going to win both these games, but I would be stunned if they lost both. I just don't see that happening with this team.
Yeah, I saw that note, John, about the 25,688 estimated miles flown for the Seahawks during last season, that around-the-world team that they are, because they have to go so far to everybody. They even have a whole breakdown. And these aren't things that are in normal NFL team notes, right, where they're breaking down flight times and things like that.
Yeah, it is, and it is very difficult. But I've always said with the NFL, we always talk about different things, whether it's home field advantages, whether it's body clock games going east to west or vice versa, west to east. But it never comes into play with good teams. In other words, if you're good, and you generally win. It doesn't matter what obstacles you're facing. The example I always give is the Green Bay Packers, because Lambeau Field has had this storied tradition for so long, and people think it's this great home field advantage, which it has been. But I always point out it didn't exist between Bart Starr and Brett Favre, which is basically 2 decades. It didn't exist for a very long time because the Packers had a really, really bad football team. When it existed, it was because they had Brett Favre and Aaron Rodgers and way back Bart Starr, as I mentioned. Then they were really good at home. You know why? Because they were a really good football team.
John McMullen's with us, 97.3 ESPN.com, covers the Eagles and, of course, the NFL. Check out his Eagles coverage on our website along with his NFL column, and we'll dive into some NFL stuff here as well as the Eagles. A lot of people talk about this as their toughest matchup. You wrote about it. But realistically, this is not close to the same Seahawks team that they have been over the previous 6 years with Russell Wilson, right? I mean, this is probably the worst incarnation of this Seattle team at this stage of the season since Wilson has been their quarterback.
Yeah, I think it is, and that's a long time, really dating back to 2012. They've been a playoff team every year. They've won a Super Bowl. They almost won 2. As you mentioned, they've had the best home field advantage in football over that span, and it started to waver because Richard Sherman's out for the year, Cam Chancellor's out for the year. It's not the same defense, and that's the one thing they could always count on, even as they struggled offensively, because they've never really had a good offensive line, which is bizarre. When you think about strong teams in the NFL, they almost always have a good offensive line. That hasn't been the case in Seattle. It's not the case again. So they have a lot of issues, but you look up and they are 7-4. They're a game out in the NFC West. They're still a significant playoff contender, and they generally find ways to be very, very competitive. I think if you go back to when, and it does go back to when 2012 when Russell got there, they never lose by more than a 1 score in Seattle. They rarely lose to begin with, never get blown out. So, and the Eagles have been blowing out people. So something's got to give this week, and it'll be interesting to see what does.
Yeah, and they're not normally a this big at all an underdog at home. They're almost a touchdown underdog at home, and you wonder, this is a team that has a lot of pride. They've been to a couple of Super Bowls. They won a Super Bowl. They've been to the playoffs. They're looking at the Eagles team who doesn't have a lot of recent success, and you're coming into our building, and you're almost a touchdown favorite. You could see a much like we saw with LeBron and the Cavs on Monday night, saying, "How dare you make the Sixers a favorite against us?" That could be something that really plays into this game with Russell Wilson. And look, their front seven's still pretty good, even though their secondary's banged up.
Yeah, it is. You still got Bobby Wagner, still got K.J. Wright, Michael Bennett, Sheldon Richardson. They got a lot of talented people up front. And if you look at the Seahawks, I mean, their consistency on defense, they've been a top 5 defense every single year since since this run started from
right.
2012 on. And now they're number 8. So it's not like they've fallen off a cliff. They're still a top 10 defense in the NFL, and who knows how they finish up. Maybe they'll end up top 5 again. So they still have a lot of talented pieces on the defensive side, even without Sherman and Chancellor.
John, also, this team does not run the ball a lick or very well when they try to. The Eagles are very good at it. This could be a game where, obviously, they're really going after Russell Wilson here, but he finds ways, man. He finds ways to make some things happen. So what would concern you if they don't run the ball and it's Wilson? Is there, Doug Baldwin's a guy that's pretty tough. So obviously they're not going to, I would assume they're not going to try to run the ball all that much against this team. So Russell Wilson kind of improvising, is that the biggest concern?
Yeah, it's certainly Jim Schwartz's biggest concern. He mentioned that earlier this week, and the fact that you have to contain him, and he's such a rare player, the way he does scramble around. And I mentioned yesterday I had to go back all the way to Fran Tarkington to find a comparison because there are no comparisons for how he plays the position. He really is a unique person. So it's not like you can put somebody in a number 3 jersey and say, go be Russell Wilson on the scout team. You can't even, really reach back into film of other teams. There's no other quarterback in this league that plays like him. So it is difficult. And anytime you face a unique player who does rare things, that's first on your list. And no doubt it's first on Jim Schwartz's list. And you mentioned the running game. It has been terrible, but I can't imagine it's going to be as terrible as the Bears. And they were a top rushing team in this league and got negative 6 yards from their running back. So Wilson also adds to that in the fact that he could rush the football so well. All of a sudden, you might pin up the running backs and let them run for 30 or 40 yards. But then all of a sudden, Russell Wilson is breaking off a run for 40 yards by himself. And, hey, rushing yards are rushing yards, whether they come from the quarterback or the running back.
Now, John, in some cases you'd think if he was a running quarterback or a guy that was able to rush the football that he'd maybe leave himself exposed to injury, but he started all 91 games of his 6-year career. In fact, with the Eli Manning news, do you see a possibility that Russell Wilson could one day be on top of that list for consecutive starts because he's actually durable?
Yeah, he is really durable, and that's because he's so difficult to corral and hit. But you never, I mean, when you start talking about Eli streaks in over 200 games, I mean, there's basically 2 guys. There's Brett Favre and there's Eli Manning. So you never expect anyone to get that high as far as consecutive games. But, the one thing you can take from Chip Kelly is the best ability is availability, would constantly say it, and that's true. I mean, it doesn't matter how good you are in this league. If you can't be on the field, it doesn't help your team all that much, and he's been able to answer the bell every single week.
Just to run down that list real quick, he's the 5th longest active streak. It's Eli 1 for now at 210. Phillip Rivers is 2nd at 187. Matt Ryan 3rd, 126. And Matt Stafford 107 with Russell Wilson at 5th. So one of his targets there, John McMullen, is Jimmy Graham. And Sal Powell talked about he thought Jimmy Graham could have a big game. Jeff Pasquino, our fantasy guy, thinks Jimmy Graham could have a big game. Everybody's talking about Jimmy Graham. Is Jimmy Graham back? He's been coming around. How do the Eagles look in that matchup?
Yeah, he has been playing better recently, and they've been getting him the football more, especially in the red zone. And he's one of those guys. He's impossible to match up with. So if you're a fantasy guy and you're looking at Jimmy Graham, well, you can't point to one NFL team that can match up with Jimmy Graham. I mean, it doesn't happen.
Let me ask you this. Let me ask you this, though, John. He did not get off to a great Seattle start. In fact, it's been a rocky marriage there for him. What happened to him, he was hurt a lot, but he wasn't producing. So he has evolved in that offense, right?
Yeah, and sometimes it's tough to get the tight end the football because offenses are generally geared, obviously, to getting the football to the wide receivers more. But when you have somebody who's that good and that unique and has that kind of frame and that body, basically a basketball player, playing football, and he's got that Antonio Gates mentality of just boxing people out, the ability to go get the football and strong hands and everything you need to be a security blanket. Sometimes it takes a little while, and it's gotten better incrementally. And, now it's gotten to the point the past couple of weeks, it's like he was back with the Saints, and he's producing at that type of level. So it's a bad matchup for the Eagles. There's no question about it. But you always have bad matchups in the NFL, and the Eagles have been able to do it. I thought Jordan Howard and Tariq Cohen was going to be trouble for the Eagles. That was a bad matchup on paper, and didn't turn out to be a bad matchup in reality.
John, let's look at some NFL stuff. Mara came out today. John Mara came out today and said he regrets the way things went down with Eli Manning. He says, I wish I was there. Isn't he the owner? Couldn't he put a hold on this? Like, hey, guys, let's not say anything until I get there. I mean, total botch?
Well, he could have. He's the owner. He can do anything he wants. But, I mean, that's been part of the Giants' mentality, and that's one of the things that have made the Giants one of the better organizations in this league for a long time, is that ownership tends to stay out of football decisions. And, you could argue when something bad like this happens, or it's perceived as bad by the fan base, you could argue, well, then you want the ownership involved. You can't really have it both ways. You either let the general manager and head coach do their jobs, or you don't. Generally, the Giants have let them do their jobs, and that's part of the reason, by the way, they're that bad, because they got a bad general manager and a bad head coach. But that's just the way the Giants have always done things, and I think eventually they're going to reboot after the season is over, and that means a new GM, a new head coach, and more likely than not, a new quarterback.
Well, in that case, though, if there's a new coach, does Eli have any thoughts about, I'm not coming back here, the way this organization treated me, like towards the owner? Because most of the former players that I've talked to have all said, yeah, the owner had to have signed off on this.
Yeah, I mean, in general, when you have this kind of franchise-shaking decision, generally it is something where the GM has to be on board with the coach and the ownership. So I understand where that comes from. Mm-hmm. But that said, I think I'm amazed at how this has taken on a life of its own. I'm amazed at some of the reaction in New York to this benching. So I'm not sure they thought it was going to be this bad. I really don't. As I mentioned earlier this week on the show, Joe Montana changed football teams. Brett Favre changed football. Eli's brother, Peyton Manning, left Indy and went to Denver. This happens all the time in the NFL. And as I pointed out numerous times on the show, Mike, Eli hasn't played well. Now, you can make a lot of excuses if you want, but I'm kind of amazed at the life that this has taken on, and the fact people have taken it in this direction. I don't think it's a bad football decision. I think the bad football decision is going with Geno Smith instead of Davis Webb.
Yeah, I think a lot of people agree with you,
though. I do think a lot of people agree with you. That has to move on.
And I think a lot of people do agree with you, and I think that they go down the same road you just said, that if they drafted a quarterback that they deemed to be the next guy, this isn't them deeming one of these guys to be the next guy. They're just saying, let's just try to find out. It's not a guy that it's not Aaron Rodgers coming in for Brett Favre. It's not, Phillip Rivers taking over for Breeze when, Breeze kind of was told, go find another job. This is, let's see if one of these guys can do it. None of these guys are the warm and fuzzy guy. You know what I mean?
No, I agree. And they don't have the answer. And by the way, I don't think Davis Webb is the answer anyway. I think they'll be drafting a quarterback in the top 10. However, when I say that, there's another difference, and that difference is the part that people, for some reason in New York, and a lot of national people I've seen as well, who think this guy has significant gas left in the tank, and that's where I tend to go off in a different direction. This guy is not the answer for the New York Giants if they get a new coach who understands it's not. It's time to move on. And this guy's not the answer for the Jacksonville Jaguars or anybody else. And by the way, that's not to say he will not be a starter in this league next season, be it in New York or somewhere else, because there's such a dearth of quarterbacks. I believe he is a starting quarterback. I just believe he's a below-average starting quarterback.
By the way, he was the scout team quarterback today.
Yeah, and hey, I mentioned the Derek Jeter comparison. There are two ways you can go about it for somebody who's meant that much to an organization. You can either let them play it out until they're ready to walk away on their own. And if you do that, it's going to be difficult because you're going to see poor football. Or you can make the harsh decision and go in a different direction and try to improve at the position. The Giants obviously went to the latter for a lot of different reasons. One is the coach is on the hot seat, and he's trying to prove he has something to offer. The GM's on the hot seat. So there's a lot of context you can throw into it, but he's just not that good anymore.
He did get a write-in for mayor, by the way, of New York. Sports Match Live,
and maybe he would be better at that.
Well, he's not as tall as de Blasio, but he's well recognized.
Well, hey.
And by the way, as far as being a class act, as far as being a good guy and a good teammate, all of that is 100% true. You're not going to find a better person in this league by Eli Manning, but that's not going to cloud my view of the film.
No, and it's interesting because this morning on with Golick and Wingo, Damian Woody was on there, and he had no problem with it at all. In fact, he was kind of like outraged as a former player, saying, look, there's a lot of former players that this happens to that are on that level, that he won those 2 Super Bowls, and that's what kind of makes it different. But he said, look, this is a business, guys. When the team is ready to remove themselves from you, it doesn't matter how cold they are. They have the right to do it however they want. Now, I was surprised to hear that from a former player take that kind of stance. But one thing was that Trey brought up that I thought was interesting was, a lot of people haven't brought up that, he kind of came into this league saying, I don't want to play in San Diego. Get me out of here. So he shouldn't be so surprised when a team says to him, well, we don't want you to play for us. It's time to take a seat.
And by the way, I think Eli's just upset on a human level and the fact that he's been a long-time starter. He got benched. I don't think it's anything more than that.
He's got a contract there next year. Now, if he's not the starter or they don't look at him, they release him and whatever cap hit comes. Right. Right. So it'll be interesting to see. You can't imagine because, again, he came into this league with the family kind of saying, well, we're not going to play in San Diego.
Here's what I'll just say. It's more generated from the fan base and people who think you shouldn't do this to a 2-time Super Bowl winning quarterback. And I just say that, you can make a strong argument that if David Tyree doesn't exist and Asante Samuel doesn't exist, well, you could have this exact same career that Eli Manning has had, same yardage, same touchdowns, but you lose in those playoffs or you lose in those Super Bowls, and nobody's batting an eye because they understand we're getting towards the end of the line as far as his career goes. And as I often point out, and John Elway is the best example of this. John Elway was a great quarterback, one of the best of all time, when the Broncos were losing Super Bowls. When they were winning Super Bowls, he was a below-average quarterback. But nobody remembers that because it was the end of his career, and all they think about is he's got 2 rings. Those were Terrell Davis's team. In the New York Giants instance, that was the front. That was their defensive front. That was the stars of both of those teams and both of those Super Bowls.
Well, we brought it up yesterday, John. When you talk about the teams that won the Super Bowls, the Saints, you would say they won with Drew Brees, or they won with Aaron Rodgers, or they've won with Tom Brady. You don't really say Eli Manning's name first, even though he was the MVP. A lot of times people do say, well, it was that defense, or it was that catch. He's not the first reason or name that comes out of your mouth when you reflect back. And maybe it's wrong. I mean, he led them to some road victories over some big-name quarterbacks, the whole 9 yards. But, hey, look, Brett Favre went out crying. He didn't want to leave. They told him, it's time. We have Aaron Rodgers. It's time to go. And he went and played with the Jets and then Minnesota and all over the place. But, again, I think it was the timing that was a little different. But, hey, this will continue on until there's a resolve in it. We'll see where Eli ends up. He will obviously, we'll see if he's even active on Sunday. He was a scout team quarterback today.
And they said they want to play Geno.
Well, they said they want to play Geno Smith and Davis Webb, so they're not going to activate 3 quarterbacks on game day, so he might be inactive.
Yeah, I think they already indicated he's going to be the backup this week. I think what they're trying to do is gear up Davis Webb for the final couple games, and they're trying to get him up to speed to where they can get a look at him. And ultimately, it will be probably Davis Webb and then Eli being the backup and Geno sitting again. It's definitely a mess. They didn't handle it the way they should have.
Nope.
There's no question about that, but I think Damian Woody that you mentioned brings up a good point. I mean, this happens all the time in the NFL with bad teams. This is a 2-9 team. This is a team where, as I said, the head coach and the GM are both trying to save their job. And really the only way they can do that is to create some optimism going into next season where you can say, maybe, you know what, if 18 guys didn't go on injured reserve, and we have a good young quarterback, maybe things can turn around quickly, as they often do in this league, by the way.
Yeah.
And that's what they're trying to do.
At JF McMullen for more on Twitter, and, of course, 973ESPN.com. Thanks, John.
Thank you, guys.
Brought to you by
Take care,
Gino's,
John.
the winemaker's choice for 50 years.